Hi, folks. This is Dr. Rob Cywes, the Carb Addiction Doc. Actually, I'm going to remove that phrase from my word usage right now because I'm not going to talk about carb addiction. I'm going to go a little bit off topic, but it's still completely in the addiction realm. And as I've explored from a biologic basis, the mechanism by which carbohydrates cause cardiovascular disease. There's so much focus on lipids and fat and everything else. And I know from my Ph.D. work that we saw an injury. In the work I was doing in the lab, we saw an injury to the endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels as an initiating factor. And that got me to thinking. There I go again, knocking my glasses off. That got me to thinking about where we came from when we demonized fat. And here's what was interesting, because the fat from this disease is exactly the same fat, atherosclerotic plaque, that we see at an end stage in another disease that comes from smoking. And I'm actually going to get rid of the word smoking. And I'm going to use the word nicotine. Because while smoking literally clouds the room, ultimately it is nicotine that is the problem. And I will stand by that because the evidence is pretty strong. So here's where I'm coming from, folks. When we look at cardiovascular disease, the kind that gets caused, there's a variety of those. Ultimately, there's one of two places that can happen. That can either happen in the wall of the blood vessel, or it can come from the lumen through the wall. And it doesn't completely make sense to me that it comes from the wall. And here's why. As I said, in my PhD work, we demonstrated damage to the endothelial cells that was the beginning process of diabetes caused by sugar. And what happened 50 years ago or 70 years ago is that as more and more Americans were using tobacco as an emotion management system, they were smoking, we saw a massive rise in heart attack and stroke rates. And when people died of heart attacks and strokes, they did autopsies in their bodies, and they found, oh my God, these vessels are clogged up with a snot-like, fatty, gelatinous stuff. I've operated on those vessels. I've held that stuff in my hands. It literally is like lard, like soft lard. It schmaltz, if you know what chicken lard is like. It's awful. And the obvious observational conclusion is that, and here's how we have to distort reality a little bit. Well, these people's vessels are clogged with fat. It must be from the fat in their diet. How the hell did we get there, folks? How did we get there? I understand the observational correlation, but the human body doesn't work that way. The fat in the vessels of smokers could not have come from the fat they ate as a causative agent, because in the 1950s and 60s, when we were still eating a reasonable human diet, the people that didn't smoke didn't have those problems. So the correlation with the heart attacks and the strokes came from nicotine use from smoking, not from the fat in our diet, because at that time everybody ate a ton of fat, but only those that smoked had the problem. It's logic, guys. So what we did is we distorted the reality, we ignored the smoking, and we demonized fat, especially saturated fat. And we started taking fat out of our diet, and we replaced it with sugar and starch. And we went from eating very little sugar and starch and a fat-predominant diet to eating massive amounts of sugar and starch, and now polyunsaturated fatty acids, industrial fat, rather than natural animal fat. And lo and behold, and this really confuses us, we saw an increase in cardiovascular disease. And then we realized that smoking was bad, so we got rid of smoking, and we still saw this increase in disease. So obviously it must be the saturated fat in our diet, and these dumb Americans are just not giving up on the saturated fat in their diet. Despite the fact that we were eating very little fat. So how could something that we weren't eating be causing this increase in cardiovascular disease. We'll talk about that in the next video. However, I then walked that back because it didn't make sense to me that the lipid heart hypothesis was correct, which is blaming fat, blaming saturated fat, blaming LDL for this cardiovascular disease. Number one, we primarily saw it in smokers. Number two, when we stopped seeing it in smokers, we saw it in people that ate a lot of carbohydrates. And I know that carbohydrates cause endovascular damage the endothelial cells. And what we've seen is somewhat of a decline, not as rapidly as I'd like, but somewhat of a decline in smoking. But we've seen a massive, extraordinary rise in nicotine consumption, particularly amongst our most vulnerable young people. You know what's interesting, folks, is that the overwhelming majority of soldiers that had autopsies done during the Vietnam War had significant, measurable cardiovascular disease. Most of them smoked. And folks, the average age of those soldiers that died in the Vietnam War was 19 years old. So at 19 years of age, they're still teenagers. They had measurable cardiovascular disease that was related to their smoking, not their diet. And that's a cause for alarm. Now, the question is, and I'm sitting here as a doctor right now, and I'm not here to sell you anything other than health and happiness and maybe a little bit of anger as you talk to the screen. So the question I have for you right now as we go into this, are you going to believe me? Or are you going to believe those kind, generous people at the tobacco companies that are now saying, you know what, you guys were all right. Smoking's really bad. Smoking's really bad. But folks, vaping, absolutely fine. No issue. Nicotine, very healthy. It was all the other things, the other metabolites in smoking that was so bad for you. And the pesticides and all the heat and all the... Nicotine's fine, folks. And if we put pure nicotine in vaping and sell it to 8th graders and 9th graders at high school, they can have so much fun with it and they're going to be absolutely fine. Vaping's healthy. Vaping's fine. It doesn't cause any problems. Well, I'm going to call bullshit on that, and I'm not here to sell you anything. Other than maybe a cup of coffee if you want to donate to my Patreon account. There's my ad. Vaping at high school, folks, has become a scourge. The CDC reports between 25 and 30%, but the numbers are closer to 50% of kids at high school vape on a regular basis. And as we learn from the smoking era, those kids aren't just doing it to be sexy or fun. They may start vaping because it's sexy and fun. They're doing it as part of a dysfunctional emotional management system. And there's no way on God's earth the majority of those kids are going to quit vaping when they leave high school. And the question is that going to cause them harm, the results of which they're going to reap when they're in their 40s, 50s, and 60s? Are they going to be dying of the same consequences of smoking because they vape? Are you going to believe what I'm about to tell you, or are you going to believe the tobacco companies saying, nah, it's fine, here's your Juul, kids? You're sending them to school with $10 to buy some Juul for those poor impoverished tobacco companies. Yeah, Juul's sexy, guys. Comes in different flavors, bubblegum flavor. And the tobacco companies say it's perfectly safe. They've done studies, folks. They've done studies. It's safe. You know, here's the interesting thing. That nicotine is chemically produced in a factory. It doesn't even come from tobacco companies, tobacco farmers anymore. So the tobacco companies screw the farmers now because they're not even buying the tobacco leaves because they're producing chemicals cheaply in a factory that cost them almost nothing, packaging it in these little plastic rods and making it pretty and selling it to their high school kids. How sad is that? So clearly we know that there are psychological deficits and psychological harm from using a highly addictive substance like nicotine. Nobody's going to argue the addictive nature of nicotine as a drug. The question is, does it do harm? Because if it doesn't, it is the perfect drug. It doesn't significantly impair you. It gets you high instantly with the first hit. And even with vaping now, there's not a lot of second-hand use. So it would be the perfect drug. The question is it going to kill you? Is it going to significantly harm you? Well, let's just look at the cardiovascular risk. And I'm going to refer to a paper here that was actually published in 2015, carefully buried, by someone called Kelly Schweitzer and her group, or his group, and it's called Endothelial Disruptive Pro-Inflammatory Effects of Nicotine and E-Cigarette Vapor Exposure. Now, in order to understand this, folks, I've got to take you down a small biology lesson, okay? So, let's look at the way endothelial cells work. Endothelial cells are the cells that line your blood vessels. And endothelial cells should be nice and flat like fried eggs, and they should be touching their buddies on either side, and the surface over here should be nice and smooth. We call it anticoagulant, so that blood just rushes by downstream to feed the cells of your body. That's what a healthy endothelial cell looks like. But here's the thing, folks. A normal cell, a normal resting cell, is round. So something active has to make that endothelial cell flat. And that endothelial cell, folks, has something called a cytoskeleton. So just like you've got a skeleton that prevents you from just being a blob on the floor like an amoeba, well, some of us are, our skeleton keeps us standing upright or at least being functional like we are. In exactly the same way, every cell has a cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton is made of three elements. It's made of actin and myosin fame, the same thing that is used in muscle cells to create movement. There are microtubules and what we call intermediate filaments that allow the cell under tense conditions to be flat. To be flat, okay? Now, a flat cell doesn't have a lot of volume, but the flat cell is actually actively engaging its cytoskeleton. Just like when you stand up, your core muscles are actively keeping you upright as a human being. Okay? Now we know from my Ph.D. work that what happens with carbohydrates is sugar very quickly enters those cells, and sugar takes water with it. And what happens to those cells swell up. And they round up, and they actually pull back their microtubules and their actin filaments, and they round up again. They take on a round shape that can contain a lot of fluid. When they do that, they expose the underlying basement membrane between the cells that was hidden by the cells. And that area is now procoagulant, and you get blood clots forming, and that is the basis for type 2 diabetes, and the cardiovascular damage gets initiated there with infiltration of the clotting cascade and infiltration of lipids into that mess. And I'll get back to that in a second. Now, this paper by Kelly et al. Demonstrates that nicotine, not smoke as the drug companies would have it, that's just smoke, camouflage. Nicotine specifically affects the microtubules, the intermediate filaments, and the actin, and damages them and causes those endothelial cells to round up. And when those endothelial cells round up, just like what happens in excessive carbohydrate consumption, as those endothelial cells now take on their natural resting shape, which is round, they bulge into the lumen, which causes your blood pressure to go up. So not only is there reduction in the lumen of the blood vessel because those cells have rolled up, the other thing that nicotine does is it activates the muscles underneath those cells, and those muscles contract, narrowing the lumen further, and therefore we get hypertension, high blood pressure from that nicotine effect. Now, the other thing to consider, folks, is purely engineering biomechanics. Where is the highest dose of nicotine? Well, you're vaping or you're smoking. The nicotine goes into the lungs, which is where the major effect is seen. Very quickly, the blood from the lungs goes to the heart. And at the very next pump of the left ventricle, which pumps blood to the blood vessels, the very first blood vessel that sees blood from the lungs are the coronary arteries. The arteries that go to the heart that supply blood and nutrition to the heart. So the highest concentration of nicotine, when you've inhaled it, is seen in the coronary vessels. And that's your heart attack and your strokes, folks. The next largest interaction of nicotine dose is to the large arteries of the blood vessels. And that's why in the smokers, they get triple aneurysms, they get triple A aneurysms, abdominal aortic aneurysms, they get aneurysms of the arch of their aorta, they get cardiovascular disease, we get carotid endarterectomies, which are surgeries that we do to get rid of that plaque. So the large vessels closest to the heart, the arteries, are the ones that get damaged with the highest concentration. And the further you go from the heart to the smaller vessels, which also get damaged, particularly down to the legs, you get vaso-occlusive disease. Then you get into your capillary system, you get into your veins, and you don't see damage there. You see very, very little venous damage, at least that's visible from a plaque perspective. Well, I'm going to tell you that that is highly likely dose dependent. Because as you go away from the heart, where your highest concentration is, that nicotine is getting taken up by the tissues, And here's the other thing, folks. Nicotine, after one cigarette or one vape, lasts, the half-life is about 2 hours. But if you're smoking or vaping on a regular basis, you're sustaining those levels for a long time, and you're sustaining that injury. And then what you're doing is you're activating the clotting cascade. And the clotting cascade forms these little fibrin plugs that then get platelets activating, that then get inflammatory cells, white blood cells coming in. And the last thing that comes in to kind of stabilize that clot is fat and cholesterol that is brought there predominantly by LDL. And that is done to kind of seal that hole to try to restore flow through the blood vessel. Try to smooth it over like spackle on a hole in a wall. And what we see when people die of heart attacks and strokes, when we do autopsies on them, we see all of the spackle. But here's an interesting thing. For smokers and for obese people, there's this sexy new test that we're doing called a CAC score, coronary artery calcium score. Well, calcium is actually factor 2 of the clotting cascade. It's a very, very early initiator of the cascade. And when you've got all this clotting in your blood vessels, you get calcium deposition. And that calcium deposition can be measured on a CAC score. That's why we measure cardiovascular damage in obese people and type 2 diabetics using a CAC score. Well, guess what, folks? When you look at people who've been vaping for more than a decade, vaping, just nicotine, their CAC scores are no different than people who used to smoke or that smoke. So there's a correlation between CAC score and smoking. How the hell can the tobacco companies tell us nicotine is safe? Folks, not only from a psychological perspective, but also from a physiologic perspective, you are killing yourself when you vape, when you use nicotine products. And if you're fat and diabetic on top of that, now you've got the double whammy of carbohydrates as well as nicotine. Nicotine exposure triggers dose-dependent loss of endothelial barrier function. This is a quote from that paper from 2015. Nicotine exposure triggers dose-dependent loss of endothelial barrier function and markedly inhibits cell proliferation and endothelial barrier function, associated with oxidative stress and brisk inflammation. Folks, there's the answer. There's the holy grail. Go look it up yourself. It's exactly the same endothelial process that happens when you eat sugar and starch. This Ph.D. saw that in the early 1990s. Didn't believe it then, because it was opposite to the hypothesis we had. But absolutely the same injury, and it can be reproduced very, very readily. It's time to let go of the lipid heart hypothesis. It's time to stop blaming fat for what nicotine and sugar do. And folks, if you value yourself, it is not safe to vape. It is not safe to use carbohydrates to excess. Have that conversation with your kids. The reason we vape, the reason we use carbohydrates and nicotine to excess is because of a dysfunctional emotional management system. That instantly gratifying drugs like nicotine and sugar help us to cope. Develop a more effective effort-based coping system, and you can slowly let go of those drugs. But please, 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 try not to feed your kids a bunch of sugary crap, and certainly discuss vaping with them before they get to high school. Otherwise, in our 40s and 50s, you can roll the dice. You're going to die cardiovascular disease from nicotine, cardiovascular disease from carbohydrates, or both. Fastest growing demographic of obesity and subsequent type 2 diabetes is 2 to 5-year-olds, folks. 2 to 5-year-olds. Fastest growing demographic of nicotine addicts are preteens and young teenagers. I hope this has made you think. The truth is out there. But people that make extraordinary profits from lying to us are not going to tell us the truth. I hope this helps. Throw some comments at me. Let's discuss. Remember one thing. It's not about something being better than something else. It's about the damage that the whole category does. Take care. I'll see you in person. If you want to set up a visit with me, I don't do nicotine counseling. I do carbohydrate counseling, obesity, diabetes. Shoot us a text to set up a visit, 561-517-0642. Or throw us a buck or two at Patreon. CarbAddictionDoc. Thank you.